Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to What Would You Miss? I have a special guest on. Of course, all the guests are special, but this is someone that I met through the chronic illness community, more of my healthcare advocacy than my, suicide prevention advocacy. And I think that her story is compelling, and she's got a lot to share with us. So, Kristal, thank you so much for joining us in our new little space here. And thank you for sitting in the chair across from me. How are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. So do you want to share with everyone a little bit about you?
Sure. Who doesn't like talking about themselves, right? So, yes, I am a chronic illness advocate on behalf of the fibromyalgia community, chronic pain community, and military veteran community. And the reason why I focus on those areas is because I am myself an Army veteran diagnosed with fibromyalgia and experienced chronic pain because of that and injuries I sustained while I was in the military. So those are the areas I focus on the most. I also focus on advocating and promoting awareness on traumatic brain injury and PTSD in relation to veterans. And, prior to this, I worked in social services for 20 years. So it just made sense to parlay into the advocacy realm and help, my communities through all this stuff. Because there's a lot of layers to having a chronic illness or PTSD or being a veteran, getting out of service. So
we talk a lot about veterans on What Would You Miss? The suicide rate is very high amongst veterans. PTSD is prevalent. And, it's hard to talk about that in that group of people, depression, anxiety, and those thoughts, as a veteran, as someone of service, you're meant to be strong. And to say that you're having a problem, that you're struggling, tends to be looked upon as weak, which we know is not true, but that's the stigma around it. Have you seen a lot of that in your community?
Oh, for sure. A lot of that whole suck it up and drive on mentality, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Fortunately, the narrative is starting to change and the discussions around PTSD, risk of suicide, those narratives are changing and they're becoming more supportive versus simply educational, which I'm finding is a benefit for the veteran community and, expanding that to let, society as a whole know and veterans is that, PTSD, obviously it can happen to anyone. You don't have to be in combat. Right. We see a lot of PTSD as well in military veterans who were not in combat, but went through a very serious situation. There's a lot of veterans who experienced military sexual assault or MST. You can have that, you lose a friend in combat. There's just so many layers to that, and there's so many reasons that someone can develop PTSD as a veteran. And one of the biggest things is that you have your physical wounds and then you have your moral wounds.
I love that.
And those moral wounds come about because I just imagine like a father who's a soldier and he's seeing what's happening to children in other countries and then like being told you can't intervene if you're seeing a child that's abused or sexually misappropriated, all that kind of stuff. So then you lose your friends in the line of duty, and then there becomes that moral wound breakdown. Like what we know the reality is here in our everyday civilian life, and then what it's like when you're on the line.
Right.
And so
I love that. I love that analogy. It's so true. And there must be some survivor's guilt there too. I guess I never thought about that. I mean, I know in the cancer community, survivor's guilt is like legit real. You feel that.
Yes. And survivor's guilt is an identifier for possible risk of suicide.
Yes.
It's survivor's guilt from being in combat, survivor's guilt because, you know, you have cancer and you survived, other people didn't. Being in a car accident, September 11th is a good example of survivor's guilt.
Right.
You see survivor's guilt amongst first responders as well, and medical professionals. So, you know, looking at suicide, what we see is that it can touch upon any community, and that there's a litany of reasons why. And there's also that grief cycle that comes with it. Like if you've seen the loss of life, you know, you have PTSD and then you go through that grief cycle. And through that grief cycle, you experience, along with PTSD, depression and anxiety.
Absolutely.
And until you lose someone, I had a brother, he passed away at 25 years old on Christmas morning. He needed a heart transplant. He had cardiomyopathy. So, and that was in 2004. And, you know, the grief cycle, you know, on average can last 2 to 5 years. And if you're someone who does not or has not experienced a significant loss yet, you really got to keep that in mind, because 6 months down the road, whether it's you lost a child, you lost a battle buddy, you know, in combat, you lost a friend to cancer, that grief cycle doesn't end in 6 months.
No, grief has no timeline. There's no timeline for it. And, you know, in the beginning of someone passing, or even like, it doesn't have to be just a death. Right now, we are all grieving different levels of grief for what's going on. It may not affect you until afterwards. It really might not. I mean, you just don't know when it's going to be. And I think that is a misconception in our world, where we think, okay, let's use someone dying. Someone has died. We had the services, and a month later, you should be over it. And I actually hate the term over it, because I feel like you don't really get over, especially a brother, a sibling, a parent, you don't get over losing somebody like that. You learn how to get through it. And there's a really big difference there. You can't replace a brother. You can't replace my mother died when I was very young. I can't ever replace her. Not that you would replace a friend, but you know what I'm talking about.
Exactly. And the thing of it is that I try to break it down I'm like, okay, so my brother was in my life for 25 years. That's not something you move past in 6 months. And when you move through it, you are moving through that cycle of grief, but that doesn't mean that you're ever over it. You will always love that person. And, you know, that is, you know, grief is one of those where it is often overlooked for the risk of suicide. Another thing that's overlooked a lot is chronic illnesses and the risk of suicide. So for example, now this is just going to be a general approximation because I haven't tracked in a while, but in the United States, the numbers range from 76.2 to 100 million people suffer from chronic pain. And the last research study on suicidal ideations in relation to chronic pain showed that almost 1/3 of the population had experienced some type of suicidal ideation or attempt, and the percentage was like 27.2%. So that's almost 1/3.
Right.
And there are some identifiers for suicide risk, and a lot of people, they hone in on mental health conditions, and yes, you know, that is a risk, but the number 5 reason for risk of suicide and why someone would die of suicide is due to long-term chronic illness and chronic pain. And what happens is, in the chronic illness communities, people on the outside look in, they misinterpret that information, thinking that I have an invisible illness. So a lot of invisible illnesses, they misinterpret it like it's more of a somatic or mental health condition because we experience symptoms of depression and anxiety. And the thing of it is with chronic illnesses across the board, like for fibromyalgia, for example, depression and anxiety are listed as symptoms. And I call these situational symptoms because if we did not have this chronic illness or other chronic illnesses that are similar, experience depression and anxiety, we will most likely not be experiencing those symptoms. So I call them situational symptoms because the situation is I'm chronically ill. And if I wasn't, more likely than not, I wouldn't be experiencing depression and anxiety. And then what happens is this narrative turns where you have a chronic illness, and then you see people in general, whether it's like society or your community as a whole, family, friends, even medical professionals, who kind of, zone in and kind of make you feel like your illness is more a mental health thing versus a
Mhm.
physical. And that is not the case. And when you look at a lot of chronic illnesses, depression, anxiety does not occur at, like in fibromyalgia, it doesn't occur at a higher rate compared to other illnesses. And
When I was diagnosed with MS, I actually had a doctor say to me, take a couple muscle relaxers and relax and you'll be fine. And I just remember being like, no, not true, not true at all. So I do agree with you. I think that I think it's very contorted, because when you have an invisible illness, they can't see it. I mean, I've been in so much pain sometimes that I've been like, how can you not see how much pain I'm in? Because it feels like you can visually see it. And what you're talking about, I think there's another layer to it, and I think you're going to agree with me when I say this. Anxiety and depression comes from that. Like when people start saying, oh, well, you look fine, it kind of
Mhm.
messes with you. Like, well, I look fine, then maybe this is in my head. Maybe I'm not real. I went through that a whole cycle of thinking that this was completely in my head and I was making it up because people didn't believe me.
Right. And here's the thing. So let's break that down to teenagers. A teenager says one thing that's true, and all of their little buddies say that's not true.
Right.
Right. And then they start getting kind of bullied for it. What we see in our world as adults, this is a form of medical bullying or gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
Medical
Mm-hmm.
gaslighting, what I call it, when it's done by professionals. And people mean well, they just aren't educated and they don't understand. How can you understand something if you're not actually walking that journey as well, right? So
Right.
I tell people you can't really I said I would be upset, but I wouldn't be angry, because you can't expect someone to understand who's not going through what you're contending with, but you can use it as an opportunity to promote awareness and advocate and educate, even if it's a medical doctor.
Right.
And there is that layer when people don't believe you. Now, and you see this a lot of times with children that are abused or individuals that are victims of domestic violence. People don't believe them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then what happens? That increases their levels of feelings of self-isolation, loneliness,
Mm-hmm.
increases anxiety, increases depression, and then you're increasing the potential likelihood of suicide risk.
Yep.
And you see this in chronic illness communities but you don't look sick. No, I don't look sick. And when you see me, you're seeing me on my less sick days, like on my days where I feel well enough where I can blow dry my hair and throw on some foundation and mascara. You're seeing me on a better day. It doesn't mean I'm not sick that day. It just means
well, and they also don't see what it took to get you there.
Right.
They think, oh, she just got up and got ready. And that's not at all how it is in the least bit. And I do think the chronic illness, especially invisible illness, is just so it's, when you're going through cancer, your hair might fall out, or you're going to radiation and you had surgeries, and it's all really visible, but invisible illness is very hard for people to comprehend. And,
like, it's like you have that depression, anxiety as symptoms because it changes your whole life. And guess what? With a chronic illness, you go through the cycle of grief as well. And
yeah, absolutely.
That grief is only for the loss of a loved one, but you can have grief for loss of a job that changes your financial situation majorly.
Yep.
I'm seeing this with the coronavirus, and people are going through this grief and worry and heightened anxiety because they don't know how they're going to pay their bills, right?
Yeah.
And that you can experience the cycle of grief after a divorce, chronic illness. So here we are with a chronic illness. We experience depression, anxiety because it changes our whole world. It changes everything. You're the same person, but it's a different normal. And then all these little things that change that you want to go back to or want to still be, you can't. And that contributes to the grief. Like you're grieving your life, who you were. And then when someone doesn't understand or they make you feel like it's all in your head, that really compounds the grief and the depression and the anxiety.
For sure.
And this is why it's so important, to really create and build tools in your coping arsenal belt, because you will always, no matter what in life, you're always going to find someone who doesn't agree, who's going to judge you and doesn't understand, chronic illness or not. So you have to have an arsenal of tools to help you with that. You have to learn how to advocate and promote awareness in a proactive, positive way, because you attract more bees with honey than vinegar, right?
That's true.
And you really got to find, especially, there's a ton of chronic illnesses out there, whether they're visible or invisible, that ground you at home a lot. MS being one of them, fibromyalgia, cancer, PTSD, you know, for whatever the reasons with that medical condition that keeps you at home a lot. So then it's like you've got to create a positive, proactive schedule while you're at home, anchoring activities, things to engage yourself in that helps promote your overall mood. Because if you don't do that, your mood's going to go lower, and then your anxiety is going to go higher, and then that
they feed off of each other. So, you know, I call it my emotional reserve. You know, I have a list of things that I put into my emotional reserve, and what would you miss is one of them. You know, we want people to talk about being grateful. You know, I heard it, you know, when I was in my worst of times. You should be grateful you have a great family, you have a house, you have this, and that just makes you feel guilty because you should feel really good about things. But using things like what would you miss in that arsenal is really a great idea, because the whole idea behind this project is to think about you, not think about your family or your dog or whatever it is, but what makes you uniquely you that you would miss if you weren't here. And it was funny. I did a podcast with somebody else on another platform, and we were talking about how this could be used in all different communities, like fibromyalgia, like, you know, MS. Like, what would I miss if I wasn't here through this illness? And you do learn to create a new normal with yourself. You really, truly do. And you can, if you look really hard, you can see that you're a pretty cool person with your illness. Without, you're still cool. It doesn't matter. It doesn't define you, is my point. So,
I'm always looking at the silver linings.
Yes.
Even the most dire situations. Just to give you an example, May of 2019, my home was accidentally set on fire.
Oh, man.
Yeah, by a roofing company. And it took 6 months and 1 week for the construction to get done. But you know what? Here are some silver linings. As I said earlier, I'm an Army veteran. I had some military stuff that I couldn't find, like my dog tags, some coins, just some things that were really important to me, especially my dog tags. I didn't care about the other stuff, although it would have been great, but I really wanted those, and I couldn't find them. Well, you know, thanks to the firemen who threw my stuff around, lo and behold, the box that I had put them in and stashed them away for safekeeping that I couldn't find for who knows how long. I thought it got lost when I moved, and it literally was there on the floor.
That is just beautiful. I'm glad.
I'm looking around. I'm looking at the water damage, fire damage, smoke damage. It smells like a bonfire. And I'm like, my dog tags. I mean, like,
yeah.
I was just like, oh my gosh, I need to have these firemen come back again and throw my stuff around. They might find some money.
That's so funny. Well, Kristal, it was really great having you on. I think it's important to share stories like this, especially in the chronic illness world, because, you know, it's not just about the diagnosis. I mean, I've even had friends who were newly diagnosed and went into severe depression because they thought their life was over with whatever it was. And, you know, you have to learn to create a new normal. And honestly, the only way to create that new normal is to have open conversations like this and understand that, you know, you look fantastic, but it took you X, Y, and Z to get there. And it, you know, where a normal person, someone who's not living with a chronic illness, they can just get out of bed and just start their day. And I know for myself, that's not how my day starts, you know. I appreciate you being here, and I would love for when we share the podcast, if you could put your links underneath it so other people can learn how to connect with you on social media, because it's super important.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I truly appreciate it. And I love that you're putting out a positive message, because at the end of the day, that's what we need to get through each day. So
exactly. And everyone, please remember, if you are in crisis, please text 741-741. They're there to support you. So thank you so much, Kristal.
Thank you.